Hi HR Nation, welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives in the world's leading global brands. Today we're joined by Jeff Belanger, who's the Global Chief HR Officer at Entera. Welcome to the show, how are you?
I'm doing well, Chris, thanks for having me.
Backstage I asked you if you had a real plant, and then because I was like, there's money growing out of the money tree.
There is. There's actually dollar bills in my money tree.
What was the rationale behind that? I want to hear the psychology.
Well, it was a gift. It was actually a gift from, believe it or not, my mother. And
should make more money.
Yeah, and she's 100%. She's like, this is good luck. Here's your money tree. And here's a couple dollar bills. I'm like, why aren't there 20s in here? They're all singles, right? So
yeah, I love it though. But I love that, like I said to you, I'm terrible at keeping plants alive. So I'm glad it looks healthy. It looks good. It needs to be taken care of. That's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well. Tell everyone a little bit more about you, because you have quite a fascinating background, and also about the company, because for people that perhaps aren't aware of the business as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little bit of background, I guess, on Entera, and then I can go into a little bit about me. So Entera, I would say we're somewhere in between a property tech company and a fintech company. And so we're one of those organizations that is tech enabled with our AI services company. We're a brokerage as well as a SaaS company. And so you bring those two together and it's all kinds of goodness. And what we do is we work and we have a product or platform that helps our large institutional and high net worth investors buy property, right? And it's the entire funnel from discovery using our AI tools, discovery all the way down into the funnel to curation of properties, and then ultimately the entire closing services process that gets that one piece of property into one of our clients' portfolios, and then we do it on volume. So that's what we do. And, honestly, doing it on volume helps us. It's a great story for us because it allows us to teach our machine to think and work better and faster on volume, as opposed to closing one house at a time and going through that process. We're doing it 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times at a moment, right?
And the financial side of it as well, of the transaction.
Yeah, so exactly. A lot of what we do is more of the legal, a lot of the logistics, a lot of as that transaction completes. Mm-hmm. And then once it goes into our client's portfolio, we're hands off. We don't do asset management, right? So we're everything up to the asset management piece right now. But as we're growing, we're looking at right now, we're focused on buyers. So one-sided marketplace, and we're looking to evolve our product platform into a three-sided marketplace. So for sellers as well as, third parties. Yeah, it's a really fascinating industry.
As someone who's going through the process right now of buying a house, it's such a headache.
Oh God!
All of the me and my wife and I going back and forth with solicitors and surveyors and everything. It's just like and various banks. It's like it's like the whole. I'm glad that someone's trying to disrupt that, because it's such a outdated. What's interesting is, like, I'm having to send everything in handwritten, like print off things and scan documents. It's like, isn't there an online way of doing these things? Yeah. It's crazy. Exactly. I'm like, seems like I've gone back in time 5-10 years. It's still the solicitors we work with very outdated. But that's just how the whole industry. It's not just them.
It's the whole industry. I remember closing on my first house, and it was a fax machine. Was the latest sort of technology to use. And then at the end of the day, that eventually evolved. But yeah, it's all paperwork. The majority of it's all paperwork.
It's crazy. That is very cool. Are you a global business, or is it just in North America right now?
Just in the U.S. right now. We're in 24 markets. I believe 18 states as of right now, and we're continuing to add to that.
Fantastic. Well, there you go. I need to figure out who's the competitor in the UK.
Yeah, well, that's on my list. I keep saying that in our executive team meetings. I'm like, hey, when are we going to go to Canada and the UK?
Yeah. So tell everyone about because you kind of described this as sort of your third career. So kind of take everyone back there, because I feel like that's a really exciting journey to where you are today.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think it's exciting. Everyone thinks their journey is exciting, but my hope is that mine is actually, it's been interesting. Like, I've enjoyed my career. So you're right. This is my third attempt at a career.
Good word.
My first attempt, coming out of university, I lived in DC. I just came off a quick stint in Luxembourg working for a think tank. I moved to DC. Washington, D.C., and worked on Capitol Hill. And I got into PR lobbying. I got into politics, essentially, and sort of that whole political machine. And I did that for a good 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years. Learned a lot about influencing, how to have a great breakfast, right? And in some ways use that as an opportunity to influence and drive change, right? And so a lot of the work I was doing was more get the vote out, constituency relations, right? Building associations, working with various customers like American Petroleum Institute or Philip Morris, right? Like all the things that people need to lobby for. Those were the organizations ultimately that I was working with early on in my career. Not proud of a lot of them, but they paid for me to learn a lot, right? To be honest with you.
I bet you saw a lot as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so from that perspective, that's when I started really getting like my mindset sort of got into a lot of change communications, right? So communications was my core as a PR guy. And as I started thinking about what's my next step, I got recruited by PwC. So Price Waterhouse and Coopers & Lybrand were just coming together as a global sort of, giant as far as management consulting, both audit and management consulting together combined. Of course, years later, they had to separate the two organizations globally. But I came in right in that sort of first class, if you will, of the joined organizations. And I had a great time. It was my MBA in a box, as I say. I was thinking, do I get an MBA? Do I go to law school? What am I going to do? And it's like, you know what? I'm just going to go work. And so, PwC was great. I did that for a number of years. And the work that I really transitioned to was more change communications, right? Working on rolling out ERP, which is awful work to do, ERP systems and learning management systems and doing all the stakeholder management communications. But as I was doing that, I was teaching. I ended up spending more time teaching and doing knowledge transfer. And that got me thinking more about being in a classroom and frankly, working with new project managers, experienced project managers, how to make a project profitable, how to build an engagement so that you're managing it effectively with all the various stakeholders. And, it sounds super boring, I know, but it taught me a lot. And then I went from that into more internally to PwC in a teaching role. I got into basically learning and development and leadership development, internal, traveled the world with that and taught a lot of the partners as well as a lot of their senior directors and experienced project managers this new methodology that the joint firm had spent a lot of time and money on building to how to run an engagement. And so a lot of it isn't just about process. And this is sort of my view of the world. We start with process and business objectives, but we always forget about the people side of it. And the fact that in the end, there's human beings who have to interpret, make judgment calls, and then lead other people around how to make this process work and come alive. And that's honestly, that's the change management side of things, right? So got into it, spent a bunch of years, eventually left PwC and stayed with learning and development. So that was my second career. And PwC was my transition. And I was the global head of learning and OD at a couple of global organizations, both technology, financial institutions, and had a great run. My mindset was I was learning how to build and take what I learned in DC as far as influencing and PR and turn it into, well, now this is how we teach people, right? And this is how we influence change and drive change through the learning process. And then from there, I learned a lot about org design, org effectiveness, process improvement, because a lot of those things all start to really roll together. Because at some point you got to roll that out.
No,
and
of
teach
course, that's the hard part, right? And that's the hard part.
Right? Yeah. Change behavior, and form new habits. And so that was my second career. And then long-winded story. I really at that point started just picking up because I was there and because this is what was going on in organizations at a time of expansion. I just started picking up more HR functions, right? I came from the L&OD side, but I picked up recruiting, I picked up HR business partners, and I started managing those teams and capabilities and started getting into the thick of HR operations and systems and then legal and employee relations. And so over the span of sort of my third career, by happenstance, because honestly, I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be, hey, I want to be an HR guy when I grow up.
Who does?
Or an HR leader. It wasn't something that it was ever on my list, right? I started on the business side and then I moved into HR and HR leadership roles because in some ways I just gravitated towards the organization needing a business-focused, business-centric in some ways, set of goals, not just hire, fire, not just HR programs for the sake of HR programs, but the reality is like running your people-centered organization means you run a business strategy. You're not, it's think of it as a department or even a business unit within the company that has the most reach and influence across the organization to drive success. And that's how I view my role, 100%. Right? I'm an enabler. And that's what got me excited about staying in this space for as long as I have. And then, of course, now I've taken all my experiences from change management, communications, learning, rolling stuff out, right? Changing behavior, to building culture, getting a company ready to scale, right? Putting in the infrastructure and all the pieces and the pillars to go public, right? To move through various stages of investment, right? From venture to private equity to being on a public market. And I can tell you, I'm having a lot of fun. It's a lot of hard work, but I feel like I'm enjoying it now.
Yeah, no, I love that story. There's so many things to jump into, and it's interesting. We spoke in our last conversation. That's kind of like your brand now. You're the guy that comes in that helps companies build, scale, IPO, sell, whatever it may be along the way. And that's pretty cool. and in many ways, regardless of industry, country, culture, those principles are still the same no matter what company you're going into now, right? Yeah. Along the way. And I think 100%. The combination of working in the consulting arena where you're managing both ends, both internally and externally. So you get to see it from both perspectives, both the HR team's perspective, and you kind of see it from a customer perspective of all the different customers. And I think you said to me when we last spoke that you wanted to be the person seeing those things come to life, right? Because when you're consulting, you don't really get to see the benefit, the outcomes of your hard work. Right. Yeah. You're like, off to the next one.
Yeah, exactly. You're sort of the one that does all the research, digs in, gets to know all the people, and then you don't get invited to the Christmas party.
Yeah, that's what you said. Yeah, exactly. You're like, bye. And then I love the fact that you fell in love with that and understood that this function is actually at the heart of the organizations and has a reach that can really make change. So yeah, it's really cool. Like, and it's most of the leaders that I speak to that are very, very successful have had multiple careers. Yeah. It's kind of a common theme. If any of you that listen to the HR Leaders podcast, you'll notice that, every single one for the vast majority have had multiple careers. And that's what they kind of reflect to say, this is why I am where I am, Chris, because I've had those experiences along the way.
Agreed. And I think it's how you're wired too, right? I mean, it's as a leader, I suppose as an executive, having had multiple experiences that allow you to know what it's like to be on the other side of the HR stick, if you will, I think is super powerful, because you get to, in some ways, you get to predict the outcome oftentimes and say, look, when we roll this new process out, when we try to drive a new culture, like add another culture value, right? So we just rolled out at Entera our 7 core values, right? We had 3 sort of loose values, but when I came in, I've been in this role now for just over 4 months. And so building a lot as fast as possible to sustain the growth over a period of time, right? But honestly, the DNA are those core values, because it's going to allow us to refer to those as a way of working. Especially
I'm going to have to test you on them now, Jeff. You know that, right? Now you brought them up. So I hope you have them.
I know. I'm not going to be able to rattle them off. They're so new.
No, I'm playing. Like,
I'm not living values.
No, it's interesting because that part is something that companies very much, they rush through that process. And if we've seen anything over the last 2 years, what's attracting people to work in organizations isn't so much the paycheck. It's the why, the value. How is my why connected to the business's why, my purpose? And that's really where you're going to shine in terms of your employee value proposition. Yep. Not so much the fancy office anymore. Not so much that you're paying more. That's now the glue, the stickiness to the business.
Yeah, everyone has a choice, and everybody, and even more so now after as we're coming out of the pandemic, more and more in country by country, everyone is aware they have a choice, and they have this empowerment to make that choice and use that choice, right? Which is amazing. I've always said, every one of my executive teams, I'm like, look, employees are always smarter than we think they are. And so don't try to fool them and do this top-down thing and say, no, this is the best thing for you, right? This has to be a bottoms-up and top-down thing together, right? And so I 100% agree. People have a choice. And I got to tell you, if they don't see themselves in your organization they're not going to join. And then, by the way, once they do join, 3 months in, they make a decision. 3 to 6 months in, they're saying, hey, do I want to stay? And that's that point that we have to be able to not just hire people, which everyone's right now, it's a great market for finding a job. It's not a great market if you're someone like myself who's trying to incent and drive people to come to an organization like ours, because we are very fast growing, but it's also like we're building pieces as we go. And so I tell every one of my new managers that I interview or that I try to bring in and say, look, it's like this is a downshift if you've been at a big organization, which when you downshift, the motor revs a little faster, you pick up speed, you got to lean into the wind a little bit more. I said, because that's where we are. We're building stuff as we go. And we're doing 65, 75, kilometers an hour. We're not sitting back and waiting for someone to tell us what to do. And I think that environment, it allows you to say, the type of person who would move into an organization at our stage is very different than someone who would be at a much larger or mid-sized mature organization in some ways.
It's good to set those expectations, right? Sometimes we're so desperate to hire talent that we don't do that, and then what happens is they leave anyway. So now you spent all of that time, money, energy, and then 3 months, 4 months later, they're gone anyway. And you're like, you can say what you want on the outside, but unless you're living those values, the why and what you're selling, it's a waste of time.
100%. It's the pillars, right? You need to put the pillars in place to not just hire. And there's this whole misnomer. I think it's a misnomer of hyper growth companies, right? It's a great fancy phrase that we all use in the talent space. And everyone loves it. Oh, hyper growth, exciting, right? But the reality of hyper growth is all you're doing is you're hiring. Right. And what that means is, hey, we're going to onboard 100, 150 people a month. Great. Then what do you do with them? And then how do you retain them? Do they know their job? Oftentimes, if you're hiring that fast and you don't have the other infrastructure in place, like the core values, the culture, right? Opportunities for inclusive, work styles across the organization, learning and development, growth and development. And, again, this idea of sort of nurturing someone through their career and identifying gaps as they go. And they're here to learn as a career defining experience. If you don't have that stuff in place, they're not going to stick around. And so I've seen organizations, they're hiring 150 people a month, onboarding them. And then in 3 months, they're out because they don't even know what their job is oftentimes, right? Or what their level and who they report to. So like hyper growth companies have kinks. And if you don't build the other stuff with it, it's not just about building a great recruiting machine and selling, right? Selling and maintaining and driving that growth and that.
What advice would you, because I've seen many HR leaders coming to the organizations like that and struggle. So what advice would you give to HR leaders that are coming into hyper growth organizations? Because this is something, the area that you really thrive in.
Focus on the basics. And I know I always go back to this phrase, and my team's tired of hearing me, about saying this, but good hiring means setting the bar. And that bar means that, yes, you need to be running as fast as possible, but you also need to be taking a breath every now and then, recalibrate, understand if the profile is effective and it's working. And then at the same time, ensure that as that profile comes alive, that you're holding your hiring managers accountable, everybody accountable in that recruiting process. So that's important at the recruiting stage, right? Is don't settle. Like really, it's hard work. Get out there, start to build that employment brand. But at the end of the day, it's really about the recruiting process, the actual interview and selection process that is going to win the day. And then, so if you get that pillar up and running, I think the other one that's important is not just the core values, like how we want to work. And the core values really are, it's today and it's aspirational. And this is how we choose to come together and how we choose to work. So getting those in place and starting to integrate those into the DNA, I think that's step number 2. If anything, that's probably step 1B, right? And then step 1C instead of step 3, I would say, is focus on growth, right? Growth and development, growth mindset, because what that's going to do is that's going to take you, you're likely at an earlier stage company, you've got a bit of a hero culture. You've got one person doing 4 jobs. And there's not a lot of focus and it's fires everywhere and everyone's running and it's more of a consensus sort of driven decision-making process, which is great. It's exciting. Early stage companies are so invigorating. But then when you start to scale, you actually have to create focus. You have to create a title level structure, right? Like a career framework. You have to start to say, hey, you have 4 jobs. Now you have 1, and I need you to be great at it. Because if you're great at this job and this person's great at this job, we can now maximize everyone's performance across the entire organization, not just your team. So then you start having those conversations. And when I oftentimes call this the sort of early, the early stage hangover, right? Where it's that change from the hero culture into the team culture, right? Is hard because you've got people now who have been doing this from the beginning, and they've become experts. But are they people managers? Are they leaders? Do they really understand the business and how to scale it? Maybe not. But I'm going to come in and I'm going to go and find people outside who have done that. And I'm going to bring them in. And now I've got this clash, a little bit of a clash of cultures. And so if I'm not building a growth mindset with my current, there's no way I'm going to be able to attract and connect these cultures together to get through that hump, right? That, again, I call it the early stage hangover. Everyone calls it something different, but it's hard. It's hard to get through that so that you're building now a consistent level of performance and in some ways an organization that's focused more on being one company as they grow, as opposed to these sort of fractionalized organizations. So that's, for me, the biggest focus. It's just great interviewing, great selection. It's core values out of the gate. If you don't have them, create them. And it's not hard. It's just, unfortunately, you need your leadership team. You need to be able to work with people to get that done. And then third is building out a growth mindset, because you're going to have to build a leadership bench pretty quickly as you scale.
Love that.
And that's for me, the big 3. Yeah. The next is all the stuff that you need.
The next is good luck.
The next is good luck. You need great benefits. You need to understand compensation, market data, like all the people ops stuff. You can do that a little bit later.
But do you remember that used to be first?
I know.
See how that's shifted, right? What you just...
it's shifted. Yeah, because there's a lot of systems and services that can get you by. You don't need to worry about a lot of that stuff early on, right? Some of it takes care of itself, but you do have to watch it and know, like, if you're a Series C or D company, we're Series A, going through, at some point going to a Series B from a venture growth perspective. But if you're a Series C or D, you better start thinking about building a total rewards capability, right? Because you've got to start standing up committees, compensation committees, audit committees, all these kinds of things. And so that's when you need that. You don't need that in early stage, as you build the infrastructure pieces.
Yeah. Something was also interesting that you spoke about when we last time was around being a builder versus an optimizer. Yeah. Could you share a bit more around that? And
I think some of it is, Chris, it's what gets you out of bed in the morning, right? And I think what, in some ways, how you're wired, right? For me, I've realized throughout the years, and I've been at big companies and I've been at mid-sized companies, and this is the smallest sort of earlier stage company I've been at, but I've realized, having been in the consulting world, management consulting, is that oftentimes you're coming in as a consultant to optimize things. You're a bit of a mechanic, right? You sort of go to work on the engine, you try to optimize it, you make it more effective, you do some process improvement, change management, you roll it out, and then you go do it again. And that's great. Like, there is absolutely an optimization mindset in the corporate America, which is why we've got some strong economies, because we've got organizations that can really get better at what they do and drive that growth. But in some ways, at an earlier stage, it's also about the build and about building capability at a place that at the end of the day, like, the order with which you need to get it done. And in some ways, when you build a house, right, you got to put the foundation in first, right? You don't bring the bathtub in or wire it until you've got the foundation. I mean, it's kind of basics, right? I guess that's why I say go back to basics. But if you're a builder, you get that thrill out of putting something in for the first time, knowing that, hey, this is only going to last me for a year and a half, this tool or this system. And then I know I'm going to have to move to the next version of this. I've got HRIS here, and I know I'm going to have to graduate to a bigger platform later. But I know when, and some of it's feel, and some of it's feedback, and some of it's I've hit my capacity, and frankly, the tool I'm using, they're trying to fire me because I'm trying to push them to do things that they don't want to do anymore, right? From an HRIS or an ETS perspective. And then it's time to move on. But knowing when that cadence
when to build versus when to optimize.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm experiencing this now as a startup. There's certain tools that we started when it was just me and Shane starting this company that just doesn't work, or they won't scale to where we are now. And we're, for example, we're about to invest in a new marketing suite, because what we had before, what got us here isn't going to get us there. So we we maxed it out. We did plugins and everything you possibly do to maximize it. And now we're like, okay, we need to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, large companies, they're always building. It's just whether you've got builders there or you've got the optimizers and maintainers, right? So I'm not a good maintainer. Like if you told me to come in and say, hey, look, here's this great function, team, capability, like, can you go manage it and just make it a little better and tweak it and optimize it? That'd be great. And I'd be like, yeah, no, snore. For me, it's like, let me go take a nap.
I think I'm the same as well, but my co-founder Shane's more of the optimizer, maintainer, making sure everything works and I make sure there's a solid foundation, and I'm off out there just building. I think that's sort of a good team from that perspective. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, because I noticed when some of the HR leaders that I speak to go from that large scale business where they've almost been in that optimizing role as a CHRO of a huge multinational business, and then they jump into startup world where you are, and they really struggle. I've even had phone calls and conversations offline where they're like, "Well, Chris, I didn't realize I just got what I got myself into." So they like the idea of joining these huge, all these VC backed companies that are scaling like crazy, but then they realize they get into the seat and the reality of what that means. And some of them were like, yeah, this isn't for me. I hear that more and more often, to be honest.
Yeah. The work's different, right? The work is different. You got to be able to dig in, go deep, and then come back out. Right. So it's transitioning in some ways mindsets and work modes, like, on a dime.
You don't have all those support functions around you.
Correct. Yeah. It's a bit like going from a PC to a Mac, right? So if you've started on the PC and then you got to learn the Mac, you got to rewire your brain a little bit, right? And so I think it's always the hard part. And so when you go from optimizing in larger scale and you go down to sort of the build mode, right? You got to rewire your brain a little bit. It takes a certain level of energy that is just different, right? And you've got to, it's because it's hard work, it's frustrating work, and oftentimes it doesn't come easy, right? So I find, it's the PC versus the Mac mindset, or it's as I get older, I'm going to play bridge and potentially cards because I'm going to need to keep my old brain moving, right? It's that shift in the work and the mindset. When you go to a build mode, you need a lot of energy and you need a lot of brain power to solve those problems because it doesn't come as naturally anymore, right?
Yeah. What would you say, I know you've already covered this a little bit, but what would you say are the biggest challenges people challenges in scaling to IPO? You've done this multiple times in organizations.
Yeah, I would say some of the challenges are and I think this oftentimes goes unmanaged, right? So an IPO is not a destination, right? It's something you move through. It's part of your growth strategy, right? And everyone wants to go through an IPO, right? Not everybody does. And oftentimes you get taken off the market even before because you've done a great job, you're attractive, but maybe
someone might buy you.
Exactly. Someone might just come in and take you off the market and buy you, right? Mm-hmm. So that as you get to that stage, right? As you get to the Series C or D stage, as everyone sort of refers to it, I think there's an opportunity there to, in some ways, move the shifting tides of why the organization is moving as fast as it is as it goes towards that event, right? The thing that we always forget and leave behind are the people and the shift in the culture and that sort of mindset. Can they work in a public environment, right? So you've now had this consensus-driven environment, 50 people around a table making decisions. Great, now we're scaling, now we're creating focus. Everyone's got a job now, and now it feels like the organization is starting to figure out how to work and run itself, right? With layers and spans and all those healthy metrics. But as you really start to come towards the IPO, it is about changing work habits. It's about knowing what it's like to work in a public environment with compliance, right? With regulatory, depending on the industry you're in and all these other things. And so there is this shift, and this is often when you lose employees. Attrition goes up at particular points in an organization's growth. During that period of that early stage hangover that I described, when you're doing 4 jobs to one, and a lot of people they're meant to be in startup environments. They're not meant to be in those transition periods. But at each one of these transitions on that journey, and then the final one, right, you better stick around for the IPO because financially it's in your best interest. But some people can't. And some people get through the IPO and then they're like, I'm done, right? Like, this is too much heavy bureaucracy, too many processes. It's hard to get stuff done, and I'm not wired to work that way. So I think managing those expectations all the way through that journey is super important. I know I talk about change management.
Is that a role of HR, or is that a role of really every single line manager, leader in the organization? This shouldn't sit with HR though, surely.
No, it shouldn't, but we're the enablers, right? I think we're the ones that have to, in some ways, teach the skill and also represent and be the advocates for it, right? Yeah. And with learning and enablement, sitting within the HR organization, to me, that's being an L&D guy. That's the horsepower, right? That allows you to go in and facilitate through. Right, because that's the skill of an learning and enablement function, is the facilitation of change and learning and forming new habits. That's the power of that growth journey in some ways. Is
that one of the reasons, for example, why we've spoken a lot about your investment, for example, in coaching for all of the layman leaders? Would that be an example of a way that you can then communicate that and keep them connected to the business?
Yeah, and for two reasons. Yes. Because the coaching model, the coaching process that you would go through in any organization to sort of uncover what's working, what's not working, what you can do better, right? It's that in some ways that growth mindset model. You need that ultimately to deal with change most effectively, right? And I've found in my career as a change management guy that is actually probably the biggest secret sauce recipe, is building a learning culture and building a coaching environment within the company. What that does is it gives people the tools and the keys to the kingdom to be more self-directed and to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to make mistakes. And is this a safe environment for me to make those mistakes? Sure. But if you keep repeating those mistakes, no, that's a performance issue. And so the reality is, we want to build a safe space for you to try new stuff, innovate, get used to working differently, a new work habit, right? Growing your career, all growth mindset stuff. But at the end of the day, you got to learn from those mistakes. And that's the expectation on you, right? That's that self-directed piece. So that's what coaching does. Now, the other, honestly, the pragmatic side of the equation, to me, that's the principled side of the discussion, right? It's just good. It's good to build healthy organizations that way. The other is, it's a lot more economical to enable, if you're especially at an earlier stage, to build out a coaching model and enable managers to lead teams that way. Using a growth mindset structure, than it is to drive skills development and do heavy change management programs that will drive difference in behavior and performance. Whereas coaching allows you to build out an experience over a period of time that gives them the tools. And I've worked with a couple of organizations, one's Ace Up, and they're a great partner of mine because they get the fact that we've got to start with the concept of coaching, but learning doesn't happen in a 2-day session. That's knowledge transfer and a little bit of a learning experience. It's really what the next 6 months look like as you go to practice those principles. And so for me, practically, it's the cheapest way.
You're going to have to pay for it some way in the future if you don't.
Exactly.
It's going to come and bite you later.
Right, exactly.
So you're right. Yeah, I love the honesty in the answer. So one side, yes, it's the right thing to do. And the other side is you're going to have to do it anyway.
Start it early.
Love that. Listen, before I let you go, I want to jump into our quick fire round. So I do this with all the guests. So I'm going to ask you some questions, but you only have 30 seconds per question. Are you ready?
Okay. Yeah.
What are your hobbies and passions outside of the office?
Working on vintage cars, family, and I'm really into distilling whiskey and moonshine.
Of course you are. Vintage cars and whiskey and moonshine and family. That's it. You're done.
I love the chemistry of it all, and it allows me to be the mechanic that I used to be. Right.
How long does that take? I know I said 30 seconds. How long does it take to make your own moonshine whiskey? Is that like a long process?
Well, it depends what you're doing, but yeah, like moonshine, basic, it'll probably take you about a week. So from beginning to end, but the process of actual distilling takes you about 4 to 5 hours.
Wow. Okay. All right.
On my small still.
Nice. If you could click your fingers and change one thing about HR, what would you change?
change one thing about HR. Oh boy. I would want more HR people to be actually probably more wired and come from the business and have that sort of problem solving mindset and working with business objectives. I think for me, it's about the reputation and the ability to roll stuff out effectively. Flawless execution, is everything, right? But at the end of the day, that being able to know the real impact on the business for everything that we do, that's the one thing that I would change. I would want more people outside of HR in HR.
Well, that's happening more and more now, right? So we're seeing that, only this week I was at Lego with their CHRO, Lauren, and he's from the sales team, right? Yeah. Or, Shell last week, I was speaking to their chief learning officer who was a supply chain director.
Yep.
So I'm seeing it's actually more common now than ever, but it's good to hear that. What would you say is one thing that HR leaders don't talk about enough, but they should?
I think transparency and equality in pay. And I think that's a big one. It's a loaded one. And I realize that. And there's pending legislation state by state here in the US, and I know country by country, around that transparency. It's an important point that's going to help us achieve the thing we're all trying to build with this more inclusive work environment where we're driving towards finding talent in the hard to find places, right? And pay equity is a big one. Across the board, right? It's not just good for diversity, right? It's good for the healthy organization to grow and scale effectively. And inclusion is absolutely the forefront of that recipe. And I say it starts, for me, it starts with just pay equity.
Yeah, I love that one, but we all understand why. They're avoiding it. You can't.
Afraid of it.
Yeah, they're afraid of what they're going to find, right?
100%.
That 100%. But as you said, though, more and more now the legislation is coming in. So in a not too distant future, it's going to be a legal requirement, hopefully everywhere. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. How would you say your family and friends describe what you do for a living?
Oh God. It's funny my wife still laughs at me. My kids don't really know what I do. My wife still laughs at me. She's in healthcare, right? So in healthcare, everything's a little bit more structured and sort of everyone knows what everyone does.
You hope so. Yeah.
Well, yeah. But you get certified, you get registered, if you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you know what you're doing, meaning that you get a degree in that. And what I do, it's like even if you go to an HR program, like it's hard to say kind of exactly what HR does because it's different in every company. And so my wife laughs whenever we have friends over and we're getting down to the sharing of war stories or whatever from work. And I start sharing mine and people have no clue what I do. Some think that I'm not really, some actually early on, some college buddies of mine, when we got together for reunions and I start to describe what I do, they're like, "You're a hitman. Like you work for the agency, right?" And I'm like, "No, just because I travel a lot and I go to companies and I work with leaders and I try to turn things around." And I just said, "Doesn't mean that I kill them." I just said it's
the corporate hitman.
Right, exactly. So it's hard to describe. My mother actually, believe it or not, worked in HR for half her career. Unbeknownst to me, she worked more in the benefits and compensation side of things. And so I was kind of like, I didn't realize that I was going to be moving in that direction. So she gets it. But my kids, they're like, "You fire people, Dad, don't you?" I'm like, "Well, not really. That's kind of part of it. But, when we have more time, I'll explain it."
That's that's normally the thing that the kids do say. Yeah, it's not a good thing. It's not a good look.
No, it's not a good look. You hire them too.
Yeah, I do hire them too, but first.
Try to hire them first.
Yeah, someone did. What legacy do you want to leave behind for your family?
For me, for my family, it's I want my kids to struggle a little bit, and I want them to be passionate about something, and see the world. I've done a couple expat assignments without my family and with my family, like before I had kids, and then after, and they've been exposed to the bigger world, and we try to, at least pre-pandemic, travel as much as possible internationally, just experience different things, experience people, experience hard situations. And I think for me, the struggle is super important in life because that's a growth mindset, and I want a growth mindset for them. That for me would be I want them to be flawed. I want them to understand.
I love that, by the way, so much. Modern, yeah.
And then do something about it. Right. And that's the bit that I'm working on now.
It's interesting you say that, though, right? Because I came from a very poor upbringing, single parent, 4 kids, real struggle. And that is really what has made me successful in every way, right. Which I didn't realize that until I came a lot older, that built that resilience. I tried to own that word resilience, actually. And I do worry for Robin that she won't, almost like not having failure is actually taking something away from that experience. So how do you introduce that? You don't want your kid to be upset and crying and seeing them in pain, but at the same time, you kind of don't want to shelter them from everything, so they're not really prepared for what it really is. Yeah,
and that's the whole privilege conversation, right? That's every generation wants the best, better than they had at the next generation, and at some point, right? You have to reset that a little bit.
Because you see like the analogies online of like the more that happens, the weaker that resilience gets, and then it kind of, there's a reset. Whereas that kid loses all the money, and then the kind of family's back down, and it kind of starts to. I see like a lot of memes around stuff like that. I'm like, hope that doesn't happen in my family, but it makes sense. It actually genuinely makes a lot of sense, because I want Robin to see the hard work and the grind that myself and her mother's had to do to get to where we are now. Not that this is just
and maintain it.
And maintain it, exactly.
And maintain it, right? Yeah. And so hard work. Hard work's part of that too, I think, for me.
Yeah, love that. Well, she's here every day. I wonder what she says, because she comes here every day after nursery, and she's like, Daddy just talks into that microphone. He's got an easy job. Does nothing.
She talks for a living. Well, that's the other one. I think my kids think I just talk for a living.
I probably will get that. I reckon when Robin's probably like 5 or 6 and someone asks you, Daddy talks for a living. Yeah, he chats to people all day. That's right. Who would you say is the one person in your career that's had the biggest impact?
Biggest. I mean, so for me, I've been lucky, and I've sought out mentors, I think, throughout my career. I mean, I'd like to think I'm wired for learning. I'm learning every day.
You kind of have to be in HR.
Yeah, you do. You really do. Yeah, you don't know everything. You can't know everything, right? I'd say I had a COO when I was at State Street Global Advisor, State Street Bank. And I probably learned the most about being an executive from him. And I reported into the CHRO, and the COO was my boss's boss, but he pulled me aside and he mentored me, and we clicked, and I helped him build out, some learning and development experiences, some offsites, and, for his team. It created an awkward situation with my boss, to be honest with you, because I'm working with my boss's boss on stuff about his leadership team.
That never goes well, does it? I've been there.
It never goes well.
I've had Chris never go over my head or speak to them without speaking to me first. I hadn't actually had that meeting in my career.
I've had that meeting as well, but I learned so much from him that to this day.
What's his name? We'll give him a shout out, because I'm going to tag him on LinkedIn.
Yeah, Atello Storino. I think he's down in Florida these days, but we would get together for cigars and whiskeys and do some plotting and planning and strategizing. Nice. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot from him.
Amazing. And then last question, what advice would you give to the HR leaders of tomorrow?
You know what? Don't try so hard. And when I say that, I mean, there is this, your job isn't to just get along with people, right? And build those relationships. I would say, take the time, slow down, and learn the craft, like learn the specifics, and then rotate through other things. So if you're a recruiter or you're a recruiting coordinator and you learn that, then move into something else. Don't just stay in recruiting, and drive that. Like, if you really want to be an HR leader, you've got to taste and try some other things. And so some of it is slow down, give yourself a little bit, of breathing room, but experience more, not less, and try not to stay in one lane as much as possible.
You need to be a builder, not an optimizer.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it is. It's I hate to say become a generalist, but learn the whole thing and experience it all, and then decide what you want to do, and then say, you know what, I'm just going to stick with talent acquisition, or or whatever, right? But don't sit back and just drive hard in one area, because I think for me, I want to build more builders than I do optimizers, because there's a lot of optimizers out there that are great in their area, but not a lot that can manage a business, right? And that's what we're doing. We're managing a business at the end of the day.
Yeah. Look, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on the show. It's a real pleasure. And I don't drink, but if I come and see you, I'll have one. A moonshine. I'll probably last one drink. I'm done. I'll be laying on the floor, just sitting next to the money tree. I'll be hugging the money tree, just sitting on the floor.
That's right.
It'll be fine.
You won't be putting $20 bills in my money tree.
No. We'll probably be taking them and running. Well, listen, honestly, it was a real pleasure, and thanks so much for sharing your journey and experience. And I wish you all the best until we next week.
All right, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks.